"2018 is the year to change all of this stuff. There are 1,000 district attorneys elections across this country, and that means there are 1,000 opportunities to right this ship, and all of you have a part to play in that. Pay attention to the elections and vote. The ones at the top don't affect us as much as the ones at the bottom, and so please pay attention to your DA's elections." If anybody doesn't know what this means in the context of today, after I'm done, look up this date in 1968. "50 years ago, which was actually just 1 year before 1968, people in this country were terrorized. And I don't mean just scared. I mean the kind of terror that happened in Mogadishu today, and that happens in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Syria. They were systematically killed. They were excluded. They were denigrated. Without the protection of law enforcement, and sometimes with the complicity of law enforcement. And when we look back on images of that time, we think to ourselves, how could I have let this happen? How could we have let this happen? How could we let 4 little girls get bombed at a church and nothing happened? How could we let our neighbors and our community members get lynched from trees with our other neighbors and community members looking at it and celebrating? How could we let a 15-year-old boy who allegedly whistled at a white woman get so beaten that his mother couldn't recognize him? How could we have let that happen? I want you to take a look around the room right now. Actually do it. This isn't like a trick. Look at who's here. Cool. Good. Now do it again, and think about who's not here. In fact, by the end of this talk, I want you never to see an empty chair the same way again. Because each one of these chairs that's empty in this audience should be filled with people that look like me. And despite the fact that Chicago Ideas is so forward-thinking that they reduced the ticket price to $15, they still aren't. That is privilege. In fact, the best way that I can describe privilege is that I guarantee you the people who look like me came into this room and looked for other people who look like us. And if you are a white person, I guarantee you never have to do that when you go into a room. What I'm saying to you is that the thing that we feel about people 50 years ago, how can we let that happen? We're doing it right now. Because there are 2.3 million people in jail and prison. There are another 7 million on probation and parole, one misstep away from being part of that larger aggregate number. 1 in 3 black men born today will go to prison. 1 in 3 black women has a loved one who's incarcerated. We have 5% of the world's population, 25% of its incarcerated population. 90% of the women who are incarcerated on this planet are incarcerated here. 3/4 of them are mothers, and 50% of them will never see their children again. And when you send a woman to prison, the damage to communities is irreparable. Trans women of color are the #1 victims of violence in this country. Black men from the ages of 15 to 40 look forward to the leading cause of their death being handgun homicide. That trip you out? Because the next 9 leading causes of death for black men, 15 to 40, don't even reach that number combined. This is a genocide. I can't put it in any other way. There are more segregated schools in this country than there were on the eve of Brown versus Board of Education. There's more representation in Congress in the period immediately following the Civil War than there is now of people of color. Indeed, there are more African Americans in jail and prison right now than there were slaves on the eve of the Civil War. Fact. We need a new civil rights movement. And this isn't news to us. This isn't news to the people of color in the room. Hopefully it's not news to a lot of you. But it hasn't happened. It's not coming. And we blame a lot of the inertia on a lack of leadership. We're waiting for the next Martin. We're waiting for the next Malcolm. We're waiting for the next Rosa, anyone to take us to the promised land. But every day that we wait, thousands of more people go to jail, thousands of more people go to prison, and hundreds of more people who look like me or don't and live in impoverished communities are dying inside of these borders. So, let's not wait. Because each one of you sitting in this room has the opportunity to be one of the new civil rights leaders of our time. In the interest of time, I'm going to co-opt some of the things that David and Arthur said. Remember their calls to action? Insert poor people and black people where you heard refugees. And have the same conversation with your families at Thanksgiving about poor people and black people and native people and immigrants and queer people that you would have that Arthur suggested. That's all I'm asking you to do. Not quite. When I was 19 years old, I was standing in front of a police officer looking at him and him looking back at me. And I remember the look of disgust and contempt and frustration in his eyes because I had become a statistic. I remember handing him thousands and thousands of dollars of cash that I had made from the pounds of weed that I had sold by trafficking it from Philadelphia to Boston and back. And I didn't know at the time what I was doing was a federal crime. I definitely knew it was a state crime, but I certainly didn't know that what I was doing carried with it a 10-year minimum mandatory sentence. And when I got caught, I was like, shit, I'm going to get in trouble. But here's what trouble looked like to me. I'm going to get grounded. My cell phone might get shut off. My parents might take my truck away. I might get on academic probation in college. That's what trouble looked like to me. I didn't know that that moment that I was standing in was happening all over the country, thousands of times a day, to people that looked just like me. And I certainly didn't know that when it was happening to them, that wasn't their barometer of trouble. I didn't know because of that minimum mandatory sentence, the likelihood I pled out to my crime was 100%. And that by pleading out, I would have been a convicted drug felon. And by doing that, I would have lost the access to financial aid, to public housing, to employment, to professional licensure, all the things that keep us safe. In fact, if you're sitting here in this audience thinking that police and jail cells keep you safe, let me tell you, it's the education and housing and employment and pro-social activity and access to health care that you enjoy. That's privilege. I didn't know that standing there with this police officer, that because of the likelihood of pleading out, because of losing all of those things, the likelihood that I would return to the criminal justice system was 70%. And that each time I went back, each time I touched the system again, the likelihood I came back in a serious, more dangerous and violent offense increased until finally I'd be upstate for a period of years on your dollars. I didn't realize how close I was to the edge. And if that police officer wanted to, he could have pushed me off, and I would have fallen down a rabbit hole that has swallowed millions and millions of people who don't get to be here. But I am here. Why? Because when I was 3 years old, I won the lottery. 2 working-class white people traveled to a foreign country and picked me out of an orphanage and brought me back to the United States and raised me in a white working-class town, in a white working-class house, with white working-class schools. And college was something that we talked about at the dinner table every night. I got to go back to school. I graduated from college. I went out into the workforce. I stayed there for 3 years. I came out of the workforce, I went to law school, I stayed there for 3 years, I came out, I became a prosecutor, I stayed there for 9 years, I gave a TED Talk, it blew up on the internet, and as a result of that, a year and a half ago, I've spent the last 18 months trying to change the criminal justice system with celebrities and activists and artists and athletes and the 44th President of the United States of America, and on Saturday, Oprah Winfrey said to me, "I'm so happy to finally meet you." No. That is not applause-worthy. Nothing about me made that happen. It was about the lucky card that I drew. And it was because the police officer that pulled me over in my driveway. The police officer that pulled me over was a white man. The police officer that pulled me over was my dad. And after he put the handcuffs on me and brought me down to the station and sat me in a cell and let me sit there for an hour, we went home. And that was literally the difference between me being in the bottom of that rabbit hole and me being here in front of you. I don't want to be at Chicago's Idea Fest next year. I do. It's not. But you should be hearing from somebody else that you never will because they're locked inside of a jail or a prison. Or they're locked inside of a neighborhood that doesn't have education or housing or access to healthcare or pro-social activity or employment. In fact, let me just walk you quickly through the lifespan of the millions of kids that I see. In utero, a child who's being developed by a mother who's suffering toxic stress inherits that toxic stress, and it changes their DNA so much that we can actually see them go into the criminal justice system. There are studies that watch that see that have measured that, and we can track how that disruption in DNA means that a kid's likelihood will go up, that they're going to go in the criminal justice system. Of the roughly 800 children who are locked up in the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts, have had, on average, 3 interactions with the child welfare system before the age of 3. 75% of them. Let me say that again. 75% of the kids who were locked up in my jail have had, on average, 3 interactions with the child welfare system for abuse, neglect, or malnutrition before the age of 3. Those are nonverbal children telling us, if you don't do something, I'm going to go to jail. Those children are born, and by the time they reach the 1st grade, they've been read, on average, they've been read to 18 hours. Their suburban counterparts, 2,400 hours. Put in another way, kids in the inner city in the 1st grade have heard 30 million less words than kids in our neighborhoods. That cognitive gap, that literacy gap, frankly, that gap in just showing that you give a shit enough to sit down with a kid, studies show we can track that straight into the criminal justice system. Those kids then go to school, And having not learned how to read, they can't really learn from reading, and so they act up. They run around. They're the class clown, they're the class problem, and what do we do as adults? We punish them. We shame them. We do everything that a developmental psychologist or child psychologist would tell you not to do. And then finally, when that kid is grown, when they enter that period that we call adolescence, and that kid just wants to be around other people that are just like him, having been deprived of love their entire lives, they just want to be around kids that are just like them. So much so that they were willing to die or kill for that person, we put a label on it. We call it a gang member. Even though all of you did the same thing. Whether it was your football team or your drama club or the dance troupe or just your buddies or girlfriends in the hallways. And then, as adults, we say, now I have all the time, now I have all the money, now I have all the resources to lock you up for the next 80 years, when we could have taken that money and given you all the shit in the beginning to avoid this terrible thing from happening. Why? Because you were born in the wrong zip code and the wrong skin color. So here's the deal. 50 years from now, we're going to be looking back on this time the same way that we look back on 50 years ago. And you will have two choices on how to be remembered. Because, as Dr. King once said, in the future, it's not the words of your enemies that you remember, it's the silence of our friends. So in 50 years from now, are you going to be the person who is remembered as somebody who came and saw a talk at Chicago Ideas Fest and went back to your life and did nothing? Or are you going to say, are you going to be remembered as the person who did one of the things that Arthur or David told you to do every single day to make mankind better, to make something that has less than you better, to be one of the civil rights leaders of our time? I guarantee you, if you pick the latter, if you join me, if you help me, you will die a wealthy, wealthy person.